Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Marquit, and in this video I want to show you guys a couple of methods to create futuristic looking textures. So let's begin. Now this particular image here, just like the previous video that I did with the ancient textures, this is a past student work. A student named Tyler, the same student that I showed off in the other one. I think he did a great job on both of his textures here. So I just wanted to give you guys examples of what you could do, kind of break down what this particular student did, and then of course also give you guys some other methods and things to create futuristic looking textures. So let's take a look first at this. It's a little dark, so what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to drop in a adjustment layer, brightness and contrast adjustment layer here, so that I can just kind of lighten up the whole thing a little bit better, so you guys can see that just a little bit better in this image. But the idea, of course, is this is some sort of futuristic wall. It's got a lot of glowing things, some sort of logo for a company named Natla or whatever. But either way, you can see there's a lot of things going on here. We have different panels, we've got lights, we've got these little spheres that have different sets of lights on the logo and so on. So let's kind of break down exactly what he did. Now if I was to come up here and expand this layer up so we can actually see more of the layers here, or the layer panel a little bit higher, we can see that he's got a bunch of different layers. He didn't necessarily name them very well, but I can turn some of them on and off and you guys can see what I'm talking about here. So he does have this one called flares. Now because he has this effect, right, so we see that these lights all look like they're glowing, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment, but because he has that effect, he actually created a layer in particular to kind of enhance that. So if you'll see right here, it's just basically he went and he painted with red just here and there to kind of act like some light was bouncing around, and then really dropped the opacity. This is down to 13%. If I go all the way up to 100, you see it's just like a big mess of red lines. This is where he assumed there would be some highlights and some light bouncing around. But of course, when you make it subtle, right, when we get back down to about 13% or so, which is what he had, it's a lot more subtle. You can turn it on and off and see the difference, but it does add a little bit of value, a little bit of that kind of light bounce effect. And so keep in mind that a lot of times when you're doing textures, you want to be very careful and very subtle with your details. If you make things too obvious and too in your face, it doesn't look right. You can see how in this case he's adding just a little bit of flair, so to speak, right? But by actually adding the lights and making the scene look a little bit brighter. Now he also has all these little panels going on. You can see I can shut these on and off here, and these are shapes. So if you use the let's see, come over here and we'll take a look at the different vector tools. You'll see that there's the polygonal tool, ellipse, rounded rectangle, rectangle tool, so on and so forth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these, just a little bit, but basically he's created right here this particular shape, and this shape he then adds layer styles to. So this gives us an effect. So if I switch back off of it, it looks like a panel, and we can have a very man-made looking panel. But he also adds the bevel and emboss, which you can see right there that pops it up. And the kind of the cool, interesting thing that he did here was in his bevel and emboss, instead of using white as his highlight, he used red to help once again enhance this color scheme that he's got going on here. And then he's got a pattern overlay, and you can barely see that. And we'll talk about how to do these pattern overlays in a moment too, but we'll see how this works. So he's got these panels, and you see them all over the place, and I can turn a lot of them on or off. You'll see he's got a bunch of these different shapes. It's another panel and so on. So how did he go about creating those? Well, as I mentioned before, he has these vector tools over here. Pretty much any of these four tools here, your pen tool, your text tool, your selection, these are kind of vector selection tools, and then your shape tools. These are the tools that allow you to create vector. Now if you're trying to create like these kind of shapes that he's got here, you can actually start off by doing something like a box. So he just kind of creates this, and I'm going to make like a dark purple, something that pops out a little bit but isn't too crazy. We're going to come on here and just make a box, right? And you'll see that it pops in purple, and I'm actually going to lift it up to the very top layer so it doesn't get brightened, so it stays darker. So we just want to see this is how this is working in comparison to the rest of these shapes. Now once you've created a shape, you can manipulate those shapes using these selection tools here. There's two different ones. There's the path selection tool, which this one, if you select it, will grab the entire path of the object and allow you to move it. That's almost basically the same thing as if I was just to move the layer, except for if there was multiple shapes within the same layer, I can move them independent of each other. Now, the other one, which one right here is your direct selection, we can actually grab just one vertice. So I can come in here and make like a little box selection and move that around. And this is going to basically ask me if I want to make it a live shape so that I can continue to mess around with it or whatever. I can hit yes and whatever, and you can see this, and it will update in real time. So I can make it any shape I want. So I can create something like this, which is starting to get closer to what he's doing here, right? And we can spend the time to make this look perfectly straight and nice or whatever, but I'm going to do that too much just for time's sake for the video. However, we can come back in and we can start making some of these other interesting shapes by grabbing, let's just say I'm going to use the polygonal tool here, right? And so we'll do a 5-sided pentagon shape, and we can actually cut part of that shape out of the side of this. Now, I'm not necessarily going to match what he's doing here, but just to give you an idea of what's happening. So up here at the top, so once we made our selection, so now I'm thinking about cutting out a pentagon shape, right, as part of this to make this more complex. If we come to the top here, you'll see that the different sections that you can choose. You have new layer, combine shapes, and subtract front shape. These, I believe, are your most useful tools. The intersect and exclude I really have never used, but we'll talk about these two. So if I hit combine, so if I do combine and I actually draw something, this shape will actually be part of the other one. Now, even though we see the separate shapes, if I was to click off of it, you actually see in the layer that they're both in the same layer. If I was to click off of it, it would just look like one cohesive shape. Now, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to add a shape. So you can actually see up here, too, if you just choose combine. You can do new layer, which means every time I draw a new shape, it'll make a brand new layer, right? But as I said before, I wanted to subtract. So we're going to choose the subtract layer, and this will happen sometimes when you pick it. It will kind of invert the selection. Just hit Control-Z. You should be fine, and then the subtract will still be selected. So once that happens, you can actually come in here and create your shape. I'm going to hold Shift. Well, in this case, it's not creating a straight pentagon, so I won't hold Shift. I'll just eyeball it. And we'll draw a pentagon out like this, right? And we'll let go, and you see that it cuts it out. Now, if I was to say, take that shape, once again, as I mentioned before, I grab the path selection. I can grab this entire path now, right? And I can move that independent. And what's awesome is that it updates in real time. So there you go. So now I've created a more complex looking shape. So if we were to actually move the object around, you'll see right there that I've created a lot more kind of complex shape to create a panel effect. Now, in this case, this particular student has this shape mirrored, so you can easily mirror things, right? I can just duplicate them, by holding down Alt with the Move tool, and then going up here and hitting Control-T to do our Transform tool, and then in the width, right, we can just hit -100. So where it says 100, you can just type in negative and hit Enter, and now you've actually created a direct mirror version of that object. Now, obviously, I would want to fill this shape in and add these effects that I did with the other one before I mirrored it, but just to give you an idea of how that works, I just kind of threw that in there. So we'll delete this extra one right here. So like I said, excuse me, he's got, in this particular shape, a bevel and emboss, and he also has a pattern overlay. So the bevel and emboss is a concept that we've kind of already covered in the other video that you guys are pretty well aware of. But I'll click on the bevel and emboss here, and you can see that we can actually change this to different types. And then one thing I didn't show in the other videos, you can actually change the contour of your bevel, so you can kind of create these really interesting things. And when it comes to like these man-made kind of carved looking panels, some of these actually might be cool if we use them. So let's try this one right here. And by default, we're not seeing much, but if we leave that on there, and I'll click on anti-aliasing so that we get a little bit smoother edge, and then we'll come back over here to our bevel, we can actually increase the size of it, and you'll see that it creates this kind of really interesting effect that you wouldn't be able to get any other way, right, without changing the contour instead of that just that default one kind of curvy contour. Now, you can have it go up or down, right, and it does different things. Like this one looks like it's more like outside is beveled more, kind of has this really kind of crazy shape to it. You can even play around, of course, with the techniques like the chisel hard and the chisel soft, which will also give you various looking concepts. So really, once again, there's no one size fits all, and like that's kind of really interesting looking with the way it has the outside bevel. But there's no one size fits all, as I said before. What really you want to do, of course, is you just try different things, and then you see what looks good. You move sliders around. If it looks good, cool, keep it and move on. Now, as I said before, this student changed his highlights to be red. This, I don't necessarily need to do red. Maybe I can pick a yellow as it is the complementary color of purple. We can come in here and choose like a yellow color instead of white. So we'll come up like this and hit OK. And you'll see now that we get this yellowish tinge instead of a bright white tinge. And you even increase the amount. So it does create that cool effect if you added a bunch of yellow lights to the scene instead. And now we have a kind of more purple and yellow scene instead of a reddish, black scene. But you can do obviously the same thing with the shadows. I mean, the shadows by default are black, but yes, you can change those to any color you want. If I just wanted to change it to like a blue or something, you can see how that updates it real time, right, as I change those colors, and it's doing a multiply. So even if I was to pick the same yellow, this one's more of a greenish yellow, but even if I was to pick the exact same yellow for both of them, they're going to look different because one is blending under multiply, which is your shadow, and one is blending under screen, which is your highlight. So just keep that in mind when you're using the tool, and then you can create kind of very interesting effects. So you can go as crazy as you want with this, make these shapes as crazy as you want. But the other cool thing, like I was showing before, is the pattern overlay. So what this particular student did is he created a overlay of kind of like a grid hex kind of shape, and then just put it over this to make it look like it was metal. So even though this clearly does not look like metal, as it is just a color, if we were to put a pattern overlay on it and we chose the different patterns, now the default patterns in Photoshop, there's not a lot of them. A couple of these are extra ones that I have that you guys might not have, but you can see that you can actually change the defaults, and most of these defaults look real silly, right? Like none of this stuff would really work, but just to give you an idea of how it works, like you can select something in there and you can change, the opacity of it, so you can blend it. So now I kind of get this crosshatch mixed with the color of the background, or I can go in and change the scale of it so that it repeats less or even repeats more, right? And we can even come over here if we wanted to line it up and actually go in the scene, and we can move it and line it the way we want. Now, as I said before, this might work for some situations if you want to use this kind of, diagonal line setup, but you can do anything and turn anything into an overlay. So what we could do, so I'm going to cancel, actually I'll just hit OK for a moment, and then I'm going to go over here into some of my files here, and I can pull out like a metal texture here. So we'll pull out a metal texture into the scene, and actually turn this into a pattern. Now what you want to do, of course, is make it tile first. Right, in this case I didn't, but like I said, for argument's sake and keep this video short, I'm going to just assume that you would tile it. So using the tiling texture technique that I also teach in a separate video, I would make that tile first, but then you go up to the top, you go to edit, and then you can choose define pattern. So this would work with any image, including the previous image. Anything you want, you can repeat over and over again. So click on define pattern, and you can call it whatever you want. I'll just leave it the name of the, of basically what the name of the image is right now, and hit OK. And now if I switch back over to this, if I double click on here, bring back our layer styles, and go to the pattern overlay, I can choose in the drop down, you now see that metal that I just added, and now we can get that effect. Now it is blending at 26%, that's why it's purple with the kind of metal look, but if I didn't want it to be purple at all, obviously I can just set that to 100, and now you can see that metal is in there, and I can move it around and line it up any way that I want. Repeat it more, repeat it less, right? And of course, if it has any seams, which we see it does here because I didn't tile it, you're going to get those lines. But to be fair, when it comes to metal, if it has a seam going down, it just looks like a separate panel. And maybe you can even line it up like this, and it actually just looks like two panels, and that would even make sense, right? So it's totally up to you guys how you want to do that. And then instead of using the initial color, you can do a separate color overlay. And let's just say I want to make this a really dark metal like he has. We can just go in here and use a color overlay, which technically supersedes the pattern overlay. As you can see, it's above it. But we can change this color to be something darker, right? So we can get a really kind of a dark metal effect, hit OK, and then drop the opacity, and now you'll see that it will blend the dark color and actually make that, and we shut it off, you'll see the difference, the really bright metal versus the dark metal. You can also choose a blend mode. So if you want to try different blend modes and see how that works, just like you're blending layers over here, you can do that too. Okay, so that's just one quick understanding of how you can create panels and things like that, and then add a metal texture to them and just really sell them as something and create these unique scenes as you see here. Now the next thing I wanted to talk about, and we'll just delete this one here, is basically how the student did the lights and how lights work. So I already mentioned that he did the light bouncing with a separate layer, so we won't cover that. But the initial effect is pretty simple. And keep in mind that when you're trying to do lights, your best bet, if you wanted to make it look like bright lights, they always have to be white in the middle. It's a misconception that if I want a red light, I got to put red in the middle. You'll see that actually he's got white in all of these lights, which really sells that they're bright. So if I was to come in and actually choose, once again, in this case, the shape tool and go ellipse, if I go in and draw a little circle, and I can hold down shift to make it a perfect circle, we can kind of create this little light effect that he's got in here. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see what's going on. So here's our little object. Now we could always change the color by double clicking in this layer here, and you can choose the color of your vector, and we'll just make it white, and we'll hit OK. And now I can double click like this, and we can add a, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to add a outer glow. So if we look over here where there are different options, you have things like inner glow and so on. Inner glow won't do anything because the inside is white, but outer glow is what we want. And you can see right there, just already it's starting to look like it's glowing just a little bit, but you can choose whatever color you want. You can change the size of it. So you can see I can change the size of the spread there, or the size here and the spread. So if you want to make it like even brighter, that's cool. And of course, if we don't want it to be a white light, we can come in and change the color to whatever we want, and that will help sell a different color. Now, if you're trying to sell the color, you see how this is kind of more of a hint of a color, while this one has a very solid edge to it. If you're trying to create this effect, that's basically the spread. So if I hit OK and we want it to be like a red light just like that, we can increase the spread, and you'll see like that, and then pull down the size here. And you can mix this actually with multiple things here. So we can do this so it's a little bit harder. And I think what he's doing is he's got multiple layers of the same thing. So if I was to also increase the opacity right there, and that's actually what's really brightening it up, we increase the opacity of that. That works a lot better. But what I like to do is I like to kind of double it up. One effect alone makes it look kind of like it's like a glowing light or whatever, and that's cool and all, but a couple of effects are what's really going to sell it. Now, before I get to the second effect or the second layer of effects, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a bevel and emboss here on this object, trying to make it look like it's kind of embossed into the wall, make it more like a light instead of like a floaty thing here. So we'll click on our bevel and emboss, and this time we're actually going to choose a outer bevel. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop the size down here. And you can see right there that you're already starting to create kind of this effect that maybe it's like beveled into the wall or something to that effect. You can change the contour just like before. We can do something like a smooth instead. Maybe I do change the contour and go back to something like this, and then we come back here. Now we can play around with the size, and that looks pretty interesting too, right? Now you get that nice, really cool effect. It'll look even better when I zoom out. When I'm up close and it's pixelated, it doesn't look as good. So that's cool. We can do that, and I can zoom out a little bit and click off of it for a moment so we don't get that. And there you go. So you have this cool kind of like little light effect going on. Now, what we could do, whoops, I hit the Windows button by mistake. But anyways, what we could do here is we can grab the ellipse tool, not the ellipse tool, but the ellipse layer that we just made, duplicate it, okay? And this is what I'm talking about by doing double effects. If you just use one layer and you try to do it with one, it really doesn't sell it as much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave some of these settings on, but I'm going to change them a little bit. So with this outer glow, what we're going to do is we are going to drop the opacity down so it's not so bright, and we're just going to make the size a lot bigger. So this one kind of creates more of a diffused effect outside. So there's a bright center core and then a more of a diffused effect. You can play around with this to get kind of what you want. Maybe that's a little bit better, a little bit more opacity. But you see if I shut that on and off, you see the difference? This is just the one layer effect, the one glow, but this is with the second glow added to it, and it really helps sell it. So all these little tiny details are kind of, you know, what you want. And you can even see that he created these flares. So he actually just drew some lines and then dropped the opacity down on them to create like these little flare effects. So you can do that too. I can show you that in a moment also. So once that's been done, you can even play around with the bevel and emboss if you want to add to it, like maybe do more, maybe have a third layer of bevel that you can't get with a special contour. So maybe we'll shut off the special contour and we'll just make this one bigger. So I'm going to make this one a lot larger, so we'll increase the size so it kind of comes out like this. Maybe change the depth a little bit, and you can see it kind of carves it more on the wall. But what I'm going to do though is I'm going to drop this one to the bottom of the two layers so that the top one that does have that effect on the last one shows up. So we'll take this, we'll just switch the layers, we'll swap them. So I'll take this one, put this one on the top, and now you can see, whoops, we'll cancel that. But now you can see those two effects going at the same time. If I was to say hit Control T2 and we scale this, we can even kind of update the effect and see what happens when we update one versus the other. Right, so in this case, I am updating the wrong one. I wanted to update the bottom one here, so we'll select that one, try it again, Control T, and now I can scale this one up, and there you go. So now you can see that other bevel kind of coming out too, or whatever. But you can just play around with these effects, get anything that you want. I mean, once again, a lot of this is just eyeballing. You look at it and go, oh, that's cool. I didn't try for that effect, but that looks awesome the way it is. And then finally, of course, his flare that I mentioned before. You can actually just create a separate layer. I would like name it flare or something like that, and then you can choose the same color that's going on within the scene. So maybe I come over and I'll grab my eyedropper tool, pick a color that's kind of in the scene, and then what we'll do is we'll just draw a line. So we'll make sure that we have a little line here and make it really thin. So we'll go really, really thin with it, and we can click kind of say maybe up here, and then hold down Shift, and then click somewhere down here. Okay, and we got that little line effect. We can grab our eraser, which is what I showed you guys before, so that we can kind of, get these lines to get really thin towards the top. And you can even use the eraser with a shift. So I can click this, hold shift and then click down here and kind of tighten up that line there so it looks more like a spike. We'll click down here, same thing, just a little bit. That looks a little bit better. And then all you have to do is drop the opacity. So we're going right back to that, keep in mind, very subtle, so you get that little bit of a flare effect. You can do that, throw that in there. That's cool. You might even want to blur it a little bit. You can come up and just go up to filter and then just add a little bit of a Gaussian blur or just a normal blur, right? Just a tiny bit like that, and that looks pretty good. And you zoom out, you just get that nice subtle effect. If you want it to be bigger, of course, you just hit Control T. We can scale it out a little bit. And since it's kind of more of an effect in the background, you can do that. So that's a pretty cool little light effect that you can get with that. And so that's really what's going on with this whole scene. Just the different sets of the vectors and the lights, right, and the pattern overlays and the bevel and embosses. Okay, so that's just a couple of things I wanted to show you. Now I have a little demo scene over here, which I'll show you some more stuff. So this is actually something I did in literally like 20 minutes. It was a demo that I did in class. I've kept it. I wouldn't call this super pretty, but it does kind of cover some of the exact same things that I showed, but a little bit more. And I wanted to show you things like, say, this force field effect, right? It's like this glass effect. So obviously you can, when you're using materials and certain game engines, there are certain engines that do glass fine, right? And you can actually put on a shader that does glass. But if you're trying to fake glass within a texture, right? Maybe you're not using an advanced engine or using advanced shaders that can actually create glass. If you want to create that effect within a texture, like I have here, this could be a glass or a force field. I'll show you that real quick. And actually all it is, and you can see the layer right here, it's just a gradient. So if I increase the opacity to 100%, you'll see that I created a gradient. And it's kind of on an angle. And I don't use pure white and I don't use pure black. So when I go to create that gradient, and let me show you how to do that. So I'll make a brand new layer. I'll put it all the way at the top here real fast. And we'll work on this. So if I come in and create a gradient, so we'll grab this to change this to the gradient tool. We'll actually select a gradient. What you really want to do, and I don't have to redo this. I'll just like select some of the stuff I have in the scene here. But you can start off by choosing some of your colors. So maybe I'll choose the first initial color as like this light color over here. And remember, it's not pure white or pure black. You want to avoid those colors when you're doing these gradients. But I have it go to a pretty dark color. So maybe we'll come here and then I'll pick, this dark color. Then maybe I'll do the light right here, so maybe pick the other light, and then we'll come back to another dark color like we see here, and then back to the light. So you see how I kind of have these two gradients. Now if you want to really sharpen the blend between things, these are kind of, you see right here when I click on these are called choke points. So they're right in the middle of the 2 points, meaning the blend is perfect between the white and the light gray and the dark gray. But if I move this, I can actually choke those points so that the blend is quicker on certain areas. So we can grab these and make the blend a little bit quicker in certain areas like that, so it doesn't blend perfectly 50% between the two, and you can create an effect like that. You can hit OK, and then of course you can just do an angle with the gradient tool, right, and let go like this. It looks something that effect, and then if you just drop the opacity, once again you can give this effect like it's got this this glass feel or a plastic feel or something over the whole thing. So that's how that effect is done. Now let me show you, of course, though, this part where the force field is, and I'll take this and I'll drop this opacity down too, once again, so you can kind of see what it used to look like before. But these are a bunch of different layers. You see I'm using that same kind of shape tool methodology down there, using bevel and embosses and so on. Right here, I believe, yeah, so here's my force field. So the force field is a pretty simple concept. Really, if I open it up, you'll see that it's a lot of different things. I do have a bevel and emboss that's kind of creating this effect. Then there's a stroke, and the stroke really is what creates that glow on the edge. So I'm using an outer glow. So if I turn the outer glow on and off, really I chose, in this case, a blue, and I have an outer glow that makes this blue line. And you can see right here, some of my settings that I have in here, pretty large size, so that's coming out quite a bit or whatever, right? So we have that glow there, and then you can play around with the spread or however you want it to make it feel more force field-like or whatever you're trying to do. And then you don't necessarily need a pattern overlay. The pattern overlay is just, in this case, once again, to make this one section look like metal, and the color overlay is to darken it, just like I showed in the previous video. But the important thing here is the outer glow, and then, of course, the stroke. So the stroke is just a white line. If I click on stroke, you'll see right here that it's just a white line. If I increase the amount, you'll see it does that. Right, so we can just make it as thin or thick as we want, but that once again creates that effect that I'm talking about. Usually with the light being white in the middle makes it really bright, so we come in, we do that effect, and you can kind of create that outer effect. So we're creating this force field kind of effect on the glass area. All right, and so we'll just hit OK with that. So that is the wall real quick, so you can see that this is another method of doing all those things I talked about, just as I showed before, but as a 20-minute study spend more time on your textures to make them look that much better, but just to give you some ideas, some kind of clues as to how you make futuristic looking textures. And then finally, I want to show you this section that I call the glow effect. And I actually create what looks like a lightsaber, well, you can kind of see right here, and this is pretty simple too. We can make it any color that we want. Let's just say we wanted to do a purple one in the same effect, so just using those gradient tools I just showed you before, I can click on the gradient and I can make a new gradient. We can always save gradients too, and so we can use them later. So I can save this quote glass plastic gradient, and you just hit new right here, and then it'll save it up in your version of Photoshop, and then you can always use it later. But in the case of the gradient here, what we can do is when we're creating that effect, let me simplify it so I don't have so many colors in here first. But I'm going to come on the outside, and what I want to do is I want to make this black on both sides. So we'll grab the two sides and make it black in both corners. Then in the middle, of course, as I said before, we make it white, so that is what's the default color here. And then we choose the color that we want this lightsaber beam looking thing to be. So I'm going to come in here and choose this, and we can choose the, let's just say this purple color or whatever. And then we can come over on the other side, and we can just, I'm just being lazy, I'm just going to eyeball it, and then hit OK and have purple on the other. And then we pull in our choke points on the ends here so that they go a lot quicker, something to this effect, and there you go. And then I can hit OK, and now I can draw, and if I hold shift I can make straight line, and we can make that effect, right? So we can do it with any color that we want, right? So I have the purple one and the blue there, whatever. Now the idea behind this is I actually have created, and you'll see tutorials on this all over the internet, I'm going to spend too much time on it, but this is a brushed aluminum. Basically the way to create this is you just, you have an image, you can do a slight gradient, you can actually see like I did before, even slighter than the glass texture that I was doing. But then you add a second layer with noise, and then you do a motion blur. So if you go to filter and you do blur, you just choose a motion blur and you put it on an angle, and it creates that kind of streaky effect. So if you have a noise layer, you motion blur it, you overlay it with a gradient, you get this effect. So it looks a little bit like brushed aluminum. If you really want to learn more about it, like I said, just look it up on the internet. You'll see 1,000 tutorials on it. Now what I did here was I found an image. Let me shut this off. I found an image right here that looked like a bunch of circuitry, and I ended up cutting that out. So I used this particular image, I cut it out, and I added it as an alpha mask to this particular layer here. So basically that original layer, which means it actually just cuts out only in the area of that, and you'll see right here that we can kind of see through this texture now. So this object underneath, and even if I was to turn this one, you can see that too. If I was to even say grab my move tool, you can say I can move this back and forth, and it looks like, you know, it's kind of moving underneath. Now these are certain techniques that they'll do in some of these advanced game engines. To say you're using Unreal Tournament as the engine, not Tournament, but Unreal 4 as the engine to import your assets, you can actually create moving textures. So we can set things up that have alphas and allow a texture underneath it to move and glow. So you get this really cool effect, like the circuits are moving and so on. It's like if I was to say grab this one down here and just kind of move it, you can get this effect like right in Unreal. So you can have that moving texture in there. But anyway, just keep some of those ideas in the back of your mind, so when we get to the engine integration, you can create some of those cool, more advanced things. And I want you guys to kind of be really inspired about this futuristic techniques and how to do things. Hopefully you guys learned a lot from this video, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next one.